Welcome to the open session for questions and answers and reflections on the day. Well, we haven't had, and people don't seem to be engaging in the chat as much as I'd like. So if you do have questions, you can always raise your hand or open up your mic. I think the main thing we wanted to do was just kind of reflect on the sessions today, see if there were things that people wanted to talk about or expand more on. I know I had one. Is Tiffany still on the call? I believe so. Tiffany, are you still? Yeah.
Yeah, hi.
Hey, Tiffany. I wanted to ask you. You were talking about the towards the end of the last session and in the video. You were talking about these differences with like this. I want to say like Confucianism, or like these different ways to approach the environment. And I was wondering if you had like, I know you're teaching in Hong Kong, and I'd imagine you get from what I remember of Hong Kong, you get a mix of internationals there. But do you see those differences kind of playing out in Hong Kong, or I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around what the differences are. I'm not a religious scholar at all, but I just wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit more on what those differences were, because it's something you mentioned in the video that I wanted to ask you more about anyway.
Okay, very good question. But actually, I moved to Macau now because of the social movement. Anyway, I don't want to talk about this in this video. But anyway, because in Hong Kong or Macau, or even we are close in China. So when we are small, we are studying the Chinese culture like Confucianism, Taoism. But it's very funny. I learned it in English, so it's very funny. So, but when I have this mindset when I have in a primary school or secondary school, and how can I apply this in the research is very interesting thoughts. But I remember, if you don't mind, because when I studied my PhD, I remember Rob sent me an article about the CSR, about Confucianism, and asked me to read. So I think it's opened my mind and how to apply the culture into the CSR issue or social environmental accounting, that how can we apply this together. So I start to read that kind of literature, and then academic way. Yeah, so if you're interested, I can send you some journals if you're interested. Yeah, like I remember I read some Japanese culture as well. Japanese, I forgot the name. Yeah, like Taoism, Buddhism. Yeah, Japanese culture. Talk about like yin yang. The I don't know how to translate in English, yin yang. So the bright side and the shadow. I don't know how to make a balance, something like this. Yeah. Anyway, like Tai Chi. Do you know how to play Tai Chi? Something like this. Yeah. So make a balance. But I think some of the philosophy is very similar to the Western context, but we are interpreted maybe in a different way. Yeah. Yeah. This is my understanding. I don't know. The question on the floor. Yeah.
There was something that Tiffany said that resonates a lot to my experience being a Spaniard, and we are, of course, we are in Europe, and we have probably a cultural context which is closer to the Anglo-Saxon context, but is nevertheless distant. And she said that students, they study a lot to learn, how to do things in the, in the international way, in the Anglo-Saxon way. And, in Spain is similar. And the first thing, of course, is the first, hurdle is English, the English language. But then it's not just English, it's, a lot of cultural context. So, for example, in research, I see the speed at which scholars develop in Spain according, of course, to the international standards compared to the speed at which scholars develop in, Anglo-Saxon countries. And it's different. I don't know whether this is better or worse, but it's different. There is still a big distance, and I see this idea of studying a lot to learn, it resonates a lot to my own experience and to the experience of my students and so on. And this is, just an observation.
Carlos, I know that you do a lot of work with scholars from around South America, but do you have a PhD students as well from around South America as well, no?
Yeah, people feel uneasy to, participate in a workshop or a webinar in English, in which, you are, people can see that you cannot speak the language or you cannot speak properly the language. And so, it's something that is important when you see the number of people. In Colombia in particular, I speak all the time about Colombia. In Colombia particularly, there are, dozens or maybe hundreds of people interested in social accounting, in critical accounting, and so forth. But and they are interested, and the other thing is that they are interested in the issues. They are not interested in, publishing, or they are becoming interested, more and more interested in publishing, in saying. But they are primarily interested in the issue that is, to be said. And many of them are not here because of English. But they will be interested in participating in this because of the time, also because it's probably early no, it's not so early or yet in Colombia.
No, but it is giving people a forum where they can engage with these topics outside of English is I've been trying to join more and more groups around France to learn how to have discussions in French about these topics, sustainability topics more generally, and it's a humbling experience to jump into a room with a bunch of academics that are just firing off, and then I start up talking and I sound like a 3-year-old trying to skim through a thesaurus. It's not great.
Yeah, I see Fabian and Nancy and other Colombians, but just a few of them
hanging out. Really quick before I see Hendrik and Liana are making some comments in the chat, but I wanted to open up to Matthias. I think you had a question that you wanted to ask.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think one of the things here, we've talked about in the different sessions, so plenty of discussion about how accounting looks like and different ways of doing accounts and other things. Sometimes I've been wondering here that have we kind of touched upon the question of how do accounts inside the organizations and with the accounting professionals who do accounts and different types of accounts. So in the handbook, there's also, it touches upon professional bodies and accountancy, those different bodies who are in number of contexts very relevant. We know in the UK you got plenty of them, but also in number of other countries you got the professional bodies playing a significant role and individuals within there. So just wondering whether that would be one area for academics researching, engaging with environmental accounting, an opportunity to kind of learn more and sort of influence policy and practice towards the future.
May I comment on that, Matt?
Yep.
Matthias, I think you're absolutely correct. And the word individuals there is very important. There are lots of individuals within major professional accounting bodies pushing for accounting bodies quite challenging agendas. I'm thinking of bodies like the ICAEW, for example, and even the CPA in Australia. And there have been individuals in there who many here know who've done that work. But studying their processes and studying their successes is very interesting to do as well, I think, because they have had some success despite a lot of internal resistance. So I think your focus of attention on the internal dynamics in these organizations and those processes, and then how those internal dynamics can significantly influence to some extent how they engage with their members. I mean, Jan, for example, is now a member of the ICAEW Sustainability Committee, so she's seeing that from the inside now. I saw it as well, and I saw in particular a number of really committed, wonderful individuals pushing this agenda and pushing it against resistance and also support, but it was support which had to be politically, I suppose, seductive in some way for people to come on side. But I actually think that's a wonderful suggestion, because it's a place where, believe it or not, change can be made, and not just through their thought leadership, in inverted commas, but also through education, because a lot of professional accountants are still getting educated in that domain. And I'll just give you a last example. I'm a fellow of Chartered Accountants Ireland, and they added some integrated reporting module onto their education program about 2 years ago. And frankly, you would have made it up in 15 minutes. So you need people inside in these places who know what they're actually doing, and not just tag stuff on. And I think in some bodies like the ICAEW, for example, their new director of sustainability in there, Richard, is a phenomenal individual in terms of what he's done, and also in terms of what he's put up with to do what he's done. He's had to really work very cleverly, very politically, and that's the real world. That's how these things operate. I'm doing a study of the formulation of a major reporting framework at the moment, and yeah, the politics is huge. You cannot distinguish the political and the technical in this domain. It's just impossible in any domain, I suppose. Anyway, sorry, that's what a long-winded saying. Yes, Matthias, go for it.
But it's also like the hallmark of our modern societies is control and processes that are mediated by professional bodies and other standard setting institutions. So those kind of elements are really important, whether it be ISO, the International Standards Organization, British Standards, BSI, British Standards Institution, and then the professions, not just ours, but other professions as well. And increasingly, I think I know that the professions are starting to join together and think about common needs for all of their members, whether they be lawyers or planners or whatever. So there is a professions climate change charter, which is the opening sort of outcome of what's been a much longer process, championed by the ICAEW amongst others, for professions to be in a position to guide and shape a very rapid transition to a different pathway than what we're on at the moment. So I think that whole sort of profession standard setting element is something that we mustn't ignore, because there's a lot of steering going on in there for outcomes.
Yeah, if you just keep it on that. I mean, I think one of the, I think one of the sad things is one of the authors isn't here to do it, and certainly Jeffrey Unerman's chapter in the book is a wonderful example of how you engage quietly, efficiently, and effectively in these different spaces, and particularly the time it takes to actually bring about change. And often we we have an impatience and impetuosity, which say we point this out, and actually realizing that there are individuals wanting change, but they're working within constraints as well. And you have to understand their constraints. You have to understand how you can work with them through these different things. And again, it's a really interesting kind of change, I think, for myself, who when I was younger was a ranter and a shouter and a, kind of like throwing things at people, kind of like, that type of thing. And actually realizing that maybe makes you feel good. But actually, it's hard to bring about change, and it needs to be persistent, and it needs to be intelligent, and it needs to kind of bring people on board. So I think some of that's in the text. I think particularly kind of Jeffrey's chapter, you get a real sense of that, and other people who are engaging as well.
But I think as well, we sometimes forget that we tend to sometimes position communities or so-called epistemic communities otherwise in a particular manner, as if there is within a certain community an allegiance of views. I mean, so we'll talk about, say, for example, standard setters, or we'll talk about a professional body or an organization. But what we forget is that in many of these organizations and these standard setting bodies, these principles development bodies, there is an awful lot of dissensus in there as well regarding foci. You know, and so you have to be very, very careful about that. It's stimulated in some way by what Colin just put in the chat there about whether the book has an overarching position on the subject of politics. Should we resolve conflict by surfacing arguments or through consensus? It's not either or, in my opinion. There are, I mean, again, you can throw stones for only so long. You're going to get nowhere. And you would be very surprised about people in industry who are pushing for more ambitious reporting, etc. In some work I've been doing recently, I've been absolutely astounded by this, and also the way in which they try to try and in some way instigate some sort of a change process that's moving in the right direction. Now, that's too slow for us, of course. But at the same time, I think we have to realize that and realize, as Matthias said, getting inside there, having a look, seeing, and like even with professional bodies, you know, there are different people in there. There are people who will never move. There are people who will object to everything that's undertaken in this particular area. But there are others who are working around that. And yeah, it is frustrating, but it's frustrating in every environment. It's frustrating in academia as well, in many respects. But I think that's what we have to realize.
And a quick note on that, thanks, Brendan. Relates back to the previous segment about the global and local. So here, I think for many people on the call, important to recognize that there are many regional and local professional bodies in Latin America, in Asia, other places. So it's not only the global or the UK or the big names that we read about in the literature, but as Carlos mentioned, people want to engage, maybe not in publishing space, but they want to do other things. And here is one thing I think people could also try to find ways of sort of having an impact on environmental accounting on a regional level. And then that flows into the global discussions as well.
If I may, I will add that probably there is a temptation from emerging scholars, from doctoral students, and from the younger generation to think that the more senior people will engage with policy making, and I will strongly advise to start engaging, because it takes a long time to really engage. And if we heard the experience of Jan, Jeffrey, unfortunately we cannot have him here, and others, it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of work, as previously said, to make connections with, to engage other people. It's not something that you can do alone. It's something that you need to do with other people. So there is a value in engaging not just with policy making, but in engaging with others in the process of engaging with policy making. So this idea of epistemic communities is probably descriptive.
I think just on your point about so-called younger scholars, Carlos, it's so difficult now for people under research pressures, tenure track clocks, to even think about these things. I come from a spoiled generation. Not financially, we got paid pittance when we were coming through, but definitely in terms of the pressures to actually publish and to have these so-called hits. You know, I mean, genuinely, there was scope, a lot more scope in the environment I was in anyway, because until I joined the UK institution, I never worked under a research assessment system, and I never wanted to either. So I think we have to be wary of that as well. And some professors are more supportive than others of their junior colleagues in these situations. And I think that's a very sensitive issue. So that's something we have to bear in mind as well with regard to the time that is required to actually engage in these issues. I even find it hard to engage in this as well.
Could I keep the theme of connections? But I'd like to sort of I saw something on the chat coming through from Hendrik Wilmer, and I mean, Carlos and I have argued in several places that we need to get closer to the science, and I've really enjoyed reading Hendrik's work and also being pushed a bit about getting closer to the environmental humanities as well. And I wonder if there's something in that either Hendrik might like to say something about his thoughts on that, or whether or not that's something that might engage us in a little bit of a conversation now as well.
I'm happy to just elaborate a little. I mean, first of all, fantastic book, right? I will be using this, I mean, quite a lot. But I was just, I mean, since we've had these discussions before about the humanities and the natural sciences, all these, it seems to me that a lot of what is going on in environmental accounting is almost being paralleled by the environmental humanities, down to some of the topics. I mean, obviously, climate change and everything related to that, environmental damages, but also what we said about different knowledges, right? Post-colonialism or post-colonial collections and all of this. So it's kind of an obvious question to ask how it would relate to the environmental accounting project. I mean, can we just rule it in, which would be nice, but what would that even mean? I mean, if you have some thoughts on that, would be nice. Thank you.
As somebody that was forced to go through a liberal arts university in the States and had to take classes outside of a business school, I did not value it at the time, but it has paid massive dividends to me after university, and I think I'm still early career, but I think just going into doing my PhD and stuff, it gave me a basis on thinking about things differently and being open to different perspectives, theories that was invaluable. And just to tie it back to what we were talking about before with the professions and the role of these professionals, I get worried sometimes about how much a role the professions have in what business education looks like, specifically because those humanities aren't valued inside of a business, a core business curriculum that's going to get you, your $60,000 job, a year job right after you graduate. Those humanities topics are not. I don't think that they're valued as much in professional education course designs. So it's something that I think needs to be there. Yeah.
I find very difficult to separate the social sciences from the humanities. So we have already had this conversation, and we have a conversation, a specific conversation about accounting history, because if we think about sustainable development, this is something that is developing over time, and to understand development and time, you need to study history, and most of the theories that we are using, they come from history, so it's to me is inherent to my research, the humanities, but I don't know, just maybe not for others.
En español. Puede ser en español.
Sí, sí.
Gracias,
yo te puedo traducir cortito, que sea cortito.
Sí. Estoy de acuerdo en términos de la historia y lo ambiental. Es una conexión directa y las ideas y el pensamiento fluye mucho más rápidamente o más conectado. Entonces, estoy de acuerdo. Muchas gracias. Saludos a todos desde Colombia.
She agrees about the history and the environment. So thank you very much, Nancy. The importance of humanities to study environment.
I don't know, Jen, I wanted to build off Hendrik's question about the humanities. How do you see that kind of lining up with ecological literacy? Is that something that needs to be like a component of undergraduate or master's level courses?
Yes, and I had a lovely PhD student who was looking at capturing people's life histories of how when did they first realize that they liked being in the environment and going out in the environment and what that meant to them. And his basic premise, which is I think links so well to this, is that you don't save what you don't love. And so inculcating a connection, a joyousness, a respect, but also a love of the world in which we live is, I think, a big part of the sort of attitudinal and values that would sit beneath a whole person who then might also have skills and techniques and work in business or do whatever. So I think it's absolutely at the bedrock, and without changing individual and cultural attitudes to, is this a resource or is it the natural environment within which I live and sustain myself, is I think really important. There's a big value set in there. And indeed, on the third panel, there was some really useful conversations about that it might be, it's not impossible to feel at one with the planet from a Anglo-American Western perspective, but it might be a wee bit harder to get to that point because it might not come naturally. So in that respect, I think there's plenty to be seen in there for us all to learn from.
If I just, certainly one of the things at Birmingham, we've got very strong with our kind of our English literary and kind of dramatic and artistic center. They actually have ecological art. They have programs on it. They have engagement, and particularly about trying to communicate in marginalized communities, even within sort of like a big city as Birmingham. They actually find that actually kind of like poetry, music, and art, and sort of a lot of playwriting. They do an awful lot of kind of dramatization, local plays to get that kind of commitment across. And it's actually really interesting because they do not distinguish between the science. We've got some amazing sort of like say atmospheric scientists who work with photographers doing art exhibitions to actually do it as a way to kind of like to communicate the kind of their research. And actually that particularly that communicative kind of angle. Even I mean, I know Jan talked about sustainable science. One of the really cool things about the Stockholm Resilience Centre is some of their animations and stuff that they've got for primary schools, and just generally kind of like getting over ideas. It's just, we shouldn't have a distinction. We should merge it all together.
With that, I would like to say thank you first off to all the to the editors of this handbook, Jan, Carlos, Ian, and Brendan, for agreeing to take a chance on my random ideas to put this together. Beautiful handbook with a Kia in front. I also want to say thank you to this is exactly what you look like when you're reading it. Imagine the PDF version. Yeah. So thank you to everyone who helped out with the panels. That's Robert Charnock, Clément Fégère, Shona Russell, Merci Denedo, Tiffany Leung, Osaminion Egbon, and Glenn Fennell. I want to thank Julian Prasuth here at TBS, Desna McKinsey at Lancaster, and Chloe Carpenter and Birmingham for helping with a lot of the editing and organizing and stuff. I'd also like to thank Sarah, David, Adriana, Ying, Ri, and Mora at Absolute Translations for helping us run all the translations today. Thank you all very much, because that really made this an international event. So thank you, everyone. It's lovely to see you. With that, I guess we can close it off.
Thank you. Lovely to see you all.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.